This is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Thank you for tuning in. I don't know about you, Rama, but just doing a radio show is a very educational experience, right?
Yeah,
you learn
sure.
so much about everybody, especially when we speak to authors who've covered things that I've never heard of before. I thought Don McLean did the song American Pie.
Yes.
I'm just teasing. Donald McLean was one of the most treacherous spies of the Cold War era and a key member of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring. Mm-hmm. I read that off of the listing on Amazon.com for the book we're about to talk about. It's called A Spy Named Orphan. It is written by Roland Phillips. Mr. Phillips is an historian. He was the publishing director of Hodder and Stoughton and Macmillan, London, in John Murray Publishers. He's the grandson of Sir Roger Mackins, a British foreign officer, and the last person to see Donald McLean before he fled to the Soviet Union. So we are going to learn something right now. Good morning, Roland Phillips. Thank you. It's an honor to have you on our show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm in London.
Oh my God!
Where I live.
And I heard that the weather is really beautiful over there right now.
It's beautiful. It's perfect. I can't do it in Fahrenheit, but it's about 28 degrees centigrade, and it's lovely. Just in time for Wimbledon.
Yeah, you're the second guest this morning calling in from London. That's how I knew that.
Right, yes.
So tell me about Donald McLean. I honestly, this is all new to me, so tell me who he was.
Well, he was the single most prolific British spy during the beginning of the Cold War, the Second World War and the Cold War. He was in the Foreign Office, which is the British equivalent of the State Department. He was a brilliant man. He was a superb diplomat. And if by the chance that he was uncovered hadn't come about, and he was uncovered by a equally brilliant American decoder at the beginnings of the National Security Agency, he would undoubtedly have become a lead ambassador and probably head of the Foreign Office. And what he gave away, most critically, he became a Soviet agent before he joined the Foreign Office. In fact, his recruiter suggested to him at that point, he was a committed communist from his university days on, as were a lot of intelligent British people in the 1930s. They were seeing the rise of fascism in Europe, and they were in the middle of the Great Depression, and they thought the only way to make the world a better, more peaceful place might be communism. So he became a communist when he was at Cambridge, as you say. He was one of the Cambridge Five, known to Moscow as the Magnificent Five, and he was planning when he left Cambridge to go and live in the Soviet Union to work as a teacher of English to the workers, so that when the revolution swept the world, they would all be able to speak English, but was persuaded that instead he should go into the Foreign Office. And when he was there, his most effective and important espionage was done from Washington between 1944 and 1948, when he was serving in the British Embassy, where he gave away so much. He gave away the shape of post-war Europe. He saw all the telegrams between Churchill and Roosevelt and then Truman about the negotiating positions for the borders of Europe. And there's one telegram where Churchill says, we would like the borders of Poland to be here, but if Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, is adamant, we'll move them 200 miles to the west. So Molotov knew all he had to do was say "niet," and the borders of Poland came about where they came about. He was in on the planning talks for NATO. He was in on the planning talks for the United Nations. His most valuable to Russia spying came when he was on the Combined Policy Commission in Washington, which only had 2 British seats on it, him and one other diplomat, which decided post-war atomic planning. He was able to tell the Russians how many atom bombs the Americans were capable of producing, which was far fewer than the saber-rattling that went on, and I believe encouraged Stalin to produce his own bomb 2 years earlier than planned.
Wow.
So he was an absolutely vital, influential spy during that whole period.
It sounds like he had some kind of decision-making power in addition to being a spy.
He was, because he was going very quickly up the Foreign Office ladder, and he was in the top 3 or 4 in Washington. His next posting in Cairo, he was deputy to the British ambassador, but he always made sure that he was in on the loop of the people who saw all the telegrams. So he really was and that to me is at the heart of what makes him so fascinating, is that he worked extremely hard for his country at the same time as he was betraying the secrets. So he was both a patriot but an ideologue for
Isn't that crazy?
Another system.
That is hard to even understand. Your grandfather, did your grandfather know him, and did you ever have a conversation?
My grandfather knew him extremely well, and he was the other diplomat on this atomic energy top secret committee. And he later on, what happened when McLean, all the time that from about 1946 on, in the NSA, the fledgling National Security Agency, was decoding hundreds of thousands of Russian telegrams, or those that they could, which was only a fraction. And they realized quite early on that there'd been a spy in the embassy in Washington, British embassy in Washington, to which the British response was, it won't be a senior man, we must look at any secretaries who had nervous breakdowns, because they believed so strongly that anyone appointed by them had to be trustworthy. And it wasn't until 1951, after McLean had a spectacular breakdown. In 1949 and 50, the gap between his patriotism and the Cold War proved too much, and he had a spectacular alcoholic breakdown.
He did.
Which ended up.
He in your book, he did seem though that he did want a stable life with a partner, and he did meet Melinda.
He did meet Melinda McLean, who Melinda Marling, American, who I discovered when I was writing my book. He told, when they first met, he was a spy. She didn't want anything to do with him. She thought he was a stuffed shirt Englishman. But when he told her he was in fact a Soviet agent, she fell madly in love with him. She loved the danger of him. So he always had that escape valve. But he had this spectacular alcoholic breakdown in Cairo, which ended up with him trashing the American ambassador's secretary's flat. None of this got onto his file, and they still didn't think he was the spy they were looking for. But eventually they did. They decoded a few words, which meant it could only be McLean. And they told the top people, including my grandfather, that he was the spy, but they needn't worry, because McLean was being watched by the security services, followed, which indeed he was rather obviously, because he was very tall, and the watchers seemed to be rather short and scurried after him wherever he went in London. And my grandfather was told to act as normal. So when McLean said, "I'd like tomorrow off, please," my grandfather, who'd been told that he was being watched, said, "Yes, of course," because what they hadn't told my grandfather was the watchers didn't work in the evenings and at weekends, so that was the evening that McLean defected, and it wasn't found out till he was safely behind the Iron Curtain.
Oh, wow.
But he left his wife, though, right? I mean, he never sent for her. And
he left his wife
child?
behind, and they had 2 children and another one on the way, and he left them behind, and they were very much pitied for having to live with this man who'd kept his other life a secret. but astonishingly, and it was a huge shock to everyone who knew them and the public, 2 years later, the wife and by now 3 children also went to Moscow after him.
Oh.
And so she had known all along. And I also found out that the weekend he defected, she lied to her mother-in-law because I saw the telephone. They had taps on his telephone, and she pretended he was still around when, in fact, he'd been gone for 2 days by then.
Oh, my gosh.
So she knew all about the defection and went after him. And then, sort of with a terrible irony or whatever, when Kim Philby, who'd originally suggested McLean as a spy, also defected to Moscow in 10 years after McLean, Melinda McLean went off with Philby.
Wow.
So the man he not only recruited McLean, he betrayed him in the end as well.
Oh.
And but one of the many interesting things to me was how in Moscow McLean got sober. He became a totally unified figure. He worked under a different name because his name might attract attention in foreign policy at quite a high level for a think tank. He had a 30-year career doing what he loved best, which was working in foreign policy. And when Melinda did, in the end, and his 3 children all left Russia in the 1970s, and so he was left entirely alone, and I think was quite happy about his children going, because he felt they might be able to live the lives they would have lived if he hadn't been uncovered, but I think was very unhappy about Melinda going, and so he died alone in 1983 without any family there.
Oh, wow. In the early, let me reintroduce you, Roland. Roland Phillips is our guest. His book is called A Spy Named Orphan. It's The Enigma of Donald McLean. It's a true story. Donald McLean was a member of the infamous Cambridge 5 espionage ring and one of the most treacherous and mysterious spies of the 20th century. I wanted to go back to what you said earlier about explaining his reasons for being a spy and his fear that fascism was going to be the way the United Kingdom was run. By the 1950s, there must have been some evidence that that wasn't going to happen, and that capitalism was making life better in America and in England. But he never changed his mind about it, huh?
He never changed his mind, and he, as most of the British communists, gave up their communism at the beginning of the Second World War, both because patriotism became more important, and also because the Soviets had made a non-aggression pact with Hitler. So suddenly the Soviet Union, that had been the system that had been the only bulwark against fascism, was in league with them, and that was too much for most people. And by the 1950s, as you say, capitalism was triumphant, and also they knew by then, that about the horrors of Stalinism, the people he'd had purged and killed, and so the gloss was right off it. But McLean and a few others believed so strongly in the theory of communism that overcame that. And also, I think he was in it too far. I mean, to recant on that would have been recanting on his whole life. But I think he genuinely believed that in a perfect world, and indeed he only gave one interview from Moscow 5 days before he died, where he said the horrors of, he could see the glimmerings of glasnost and all that changed in because he really knew his policy and politics. And he said, the horrors of Stalinism are now behind us, and I hope we can now have a better communist world. So and I admired his integrity for sticking to it through. Yeah,
that's one good point.
It wrecked of his life.
Is there a way for you to help us connect the dots between his childhood and his political, the things he embraced politically?
Yes, I think it very much stems from his childhood. His father was a member of Parliament. He'd been brought up in true poverty himself, his father, but done well, became a lawyer and eventually a member of Parliament. And he was a very, very staunch Presbyterian, teetotal, wouldn't have tobacco in the house, family prayers twice a day, church on Sunday, very austere Scottish man, who instilled in his children the absolute need to follow your conscience, whereas the father meant the conscience towards God. He also set up, he did a lot of very good charitable work, but he meant largely the conscience towards God, and certainly not a conscience that would have betrayed his country, which he worked so hard for. So I think that was a very strong element, this moral sense that was instilled in him, which in the context of the times then sort of flowered into trying to alleviate poverty and stop war. He also went to a rather remarkable school, which was quite unlike any other school in Britain, a private school in Britain, where they set up. They had a disciplinary system, which effectively means you would have. It was slightly absurd. The boys, it was all boys' school then, were not meant to think in pure thoughts, which is a tough call for a teenage boy.
Oh, yeah.
And a 63-year-old man, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. They were meant to turn themselves in to the authorities if they did that, or be turned in by their schoolfellows, and smoking and swearing were the other two things, which is an absurd system. And I think that would also, Maclean was the first member of his family who might have did go to university, and so the pressure was on him to be a high-performing schoolboy, and he did do extremely well at school. Yet with this knot inside that you'd know, while conforming to the system, you'd know it was completely absurd, and your conscience would take you elsewhere. So I think a combination of his parentage and his school directly led to this remarkable man who could be one thing on one side and the other on the other.
I think what you just said right there, and how you were able to let us know about that part of his life, this is, in a way, a study of psychology, at least the psychology of one person, and
yes.
And it helps. It is interesting when we try to study the psychology of people who've made a difference in the world or who have affected the world in one way or another. The psychology always seems to be interesting, and so to include that in this story I think that's what makes this book real. I mean, you're getting really good reviews on Amazon, so I'm sure that's part of the reason.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and it was interesting that his recruiter to become a Soviet agent was a psychologist. He'd worked with he was a Viennese man who'd worked with a pupil of Sigmund Freud's, and he took a very psychological line on his recruits. He looked for 4 criteria that would make an effective spy. I think the most important of which for Maclean was a need for praise and reassurance, which is something he never got from his father, but they were always very careful until he began to crack up, from Moscow Center to say you're doing a great job and so on, and he always had very careful handlers. So I think they realized that this brilliant young man, if treated right, could become an effective agent, and they were right. This remarkable recruiter.
And is that how he formed? Did he form the Cambridge Five? And is that how he got together with them?
He did. He was a man called Arnold Deutsch who worked out that because of the times, that if you were to get young people just out of university, there's every chance they would get to the top of the institutions that ran Britain, and if they'd been very left-wing at university, as Maclean had been, and the others, that could be put down to the folly of youth if they went around university singing communist songs and so on, that then if he recruited the right ones, and he emphatically did with the Cambridge Five, then you could get right at the heart of the British establishment.
And did they survive also? Did they go on to Russia, or were they found out and were they arrested, or?
Guy Burgess went at the same time as Maclean. They defected together in 1951. Kim Philby was rumbled by that defection because they knew he was close to them, but didn't defect. It was too embarrassing to have another defector, so they sort of kept him at arm's length for another 10 years when he defected. One wasn't uncovered until after the end of the Cold War, and that was okay. And the other one was a man called Sir Anthony Blunt, who it was too embarrassing. He was surveyor of the Queen's pictures, so very involved with the royal family, and he was offered immunity. And it didn't come out until 1979 that he'd been a spy, but he'd been offered immunity in the 1960s, and people were horrified by that.
Is this part of his life something that the children are ashamed of, or how do the children react to these revelations?
Maclean's children, I don't know, because I was told there was a nephew of his who was very helpful to me and gave me some family papers, but he said the children will never speak about their father, so don't even try to be in touch with them. Two live in the United States, one lives in England, and so I didn't try to speak to them, but I did speak to, or I had correspondence with his son-in-law, who lives in England and works for the BBC Russian service. And when I wrote to him and said I was writing this book, he said he took an oath when he joined the family in 1970 never to speak of it.
Is that right?
And so neither Maclean nor anyone in his family ever spoke to an author or journalist, anyone about that. But I sense that certainly the child that lives in England I think they're proud of what their father did and gave up.
Right.
But how could you not be? I mean, it's a very difficult inheritance to have, isn't it? Yeah.
One of the reviewers who gave you 5 stars, so it's not necessarily a negative comment, but he describes the book as mildly sympathetic, and I think I see that. I think I see that too. Do you feel like you are being sympathetic in some ways, or at least empathetic?
I think I'm sympathetic. I can see him as a product of his times that led him to communism. I think the most of his spying was indeed for his stated aim of that he believed sharing this information would lead to world peace. It doesn't excuse treachery at all, right. But I do find myself thinking that this was a man who gave up an awful lot for the sake of his beliefs, and I think beliefs that strong are impressive in some ways. Yeah.
And I would rather a book that is that way than something that is so politically leaning in one direction. But I mean, you have seen the human side of this story, and I don't know that all books would treat this subject that way.
Yeah.
I think this is...
That's what I've tried to do, yes.
Roland Phillips, thank you. Call me, for the listeners, call me if you want the book. I have a copy of A Spy Named Orphan. It's right here, and it'll be on the desk waiting for you if you want it. So the number is 622-9622. Do you have a website you want to recommend for us?
No, I don't have a website of my own, I'm afraid. But if your readers enjoy the book, a review on Amazon is terrific.
Definitely review it, yes. And I did find it on Amazon. I'm sure it's where all books are sold. Roland Phillips, thank you so much. Enjoy the beautiful day today in London.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. So have we. We'll be right back.